activating your archetype. So I mean, Melissa and Mark are going to crush it as far as the rest of the webinar and talk a little bit more specifically about all of these things. But some ways that you can really activate your archetype are as shown here. So voice, tone, and messaging. I mean, at the agency I used to work at, we would have whole scopes around building tone of voice, whole entire scopes around how your personality is defined and how that shows up in messaging. So really take the time to lean in there and use tones and words that are going to resonate with the identity that you're seeking to connect with. Visual identity is a huge thing. Like that is the first impression in a lot of ways. That first hit on the website, that first ad that you see, how are you reflecting your brand's archetype in that identity? And think about energy, right? Like just frankly, energy. What energy are you giving off when you see something? What is that first reaction? And again, it's an opportunity, right? Like every touch point is an opportunity to connect. And if you're not, it's a missed opportunity. Next, customer and prospect experience. So super fun. We'll talk about this when it comes to actual tactics of activating a campaign, but how are you actually interacting with your customers? And what is the customer journey that they're going through? And how are you reminding them of the archetype that your brand is and continues to stay true to yourself throughout that experience for them? Because that's just going to help with brand loyalty in the long run. And then last thing, CTAs, right? CTAs can be really fun. I hate a boring CTA, right? Like everyone, click here, book a demo, like let your brand personality shine through in whatever way makes sense for your brand. So every time you're asking someone to do something, think about how you're translating and really asking them for that permission, right? And take advantage of it, lean into it in the best way, and always think about your archetype.
Love this. We're going to pivot to Melissa. Just one last point on customer prospect experience. The thing that most companies don't do well enough, once they develop their archetype, the persona, the personality, is they don't enable and basically train their company, especially the frontline people, about this archetype. And like not everyone has to sound the same, but if you can provide some on-demand or even some live training on a regular basis to your salespeople, to the marketers for sure, but like sales, CS, anyone customer facing, this can help them realize that, like we are this creator brand. We want to empower people, to your point, Maria, like to create the best thing that they can using our technology. So one thing that we always have to keep in mind is when we talk to customers and work with customers, that we convey that like we are here to help them with those ideations or those ideas, but also maybe we need to come up with ideas with them / for them, right? So it's like we're an extension of what we're kind of saying and promising, sometimes without even saying it. And that just comes down to training and enabling your team.
Absolutely. Oh, bringing a brand archetype to life, like throughout the organization is a whole nother beast, but it's so, so important because it doesn't matter if it's on a PDF somewhere in an onboarding, if it's not getting trained and given feedback on. And, again, it's living and breathing. So that needs to come to life through your employees. Absolutely.
Yeah. Melissa, with stories, you can do it, right? Like that's where it's a great segue.
Yes, absolutely. So I know Maria touched on not just your brand, but your brand archetype and really understanding who you are and what that means to you. And I'm going to tie that into content, right? So once you understand who you are, you can talk about the what behind what you're doing and the whys behind it as well. But we're also going to talk about this through the lens of something that was talked about in the previous webinar, which is people first, right? So putting people at the center of that, not just your brand and your own self, but also the people that are impacted by the what's of what you're doing.
You just said the most important word, in my opinion, impact.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Maria touched on audience, competition, and differentiation from a brand perspective, right? So when you're talking about crafting your brand and crafting who you are, really understanding how you either align or stand apart from those things. But as we're looking at content and starting to kind of apply that, really understanding how you can come from a position that's value-based, and really emphasizing on that audience component, right? How are you providing value to your audience, but how are you doing that through your content? How are you speaking this into existence to them through your products and solutions. And then once you understand how you're differentiating your brand from your competitors, also looking at differentiating your content both through tone and even channels, formats, distribution. Great example of the Red Bull events. They're really not only standing apart as a brand, but they're differentiating themselves in the way they put their brand into the marketplace. When you think about content, you don't really see Red Bull content in like typical forms, but those events, those experiences, all of the things that they're enabling through their channels are really differentiating themselves from the competitors. And then lastly, just being consistent in what you're saying. A really great example of this is a content audit that I recently ran through. Some of the content was very cheeky in nature, very relatable, and other pieces of it were very tech heavy and more of a deep dive, which can get kind of confusing, right? You start to lose understanding of who the brand is and what it is that they're providing if you don't see consistency in that. And through the lens of content, that really is the place where you can start speaking of who you are and being kind of creative in that. But if it's not consistent and activated across every piece of content or every campaign that you touch, then it kind of devalues that.
Yeah, it's like, why are you uniquely positioned to solve my problem? Is like ultimately, I think, kind of like what we're all saying here. Like the key thing in the middle of your differentiation column, Melissa, is so good. It's like what exactly you do that adds value for the customer that no one else can take away. And then like with that and the value that you deliver, like here's the tangible result or outcome of us uniquely being able to, you know, deliver this value in a way that then also fulfills the promise of the product, but fulfills the promise of the brand.
Yes, yes, 100%. I think a good example here and kind of how to have an active exercise to apply this is we've all heard in sales the pen example, right? Sell me this pen.
Yeah.
So when you think of that same exercise, like in terms of your brand and then applying it to your content, go through that same exercise with your brand, like sell me this, capture that, and then understand how you can implement that into your content.
Watch out for some potholes. I like this slide a lot because like you can, and actually Maria, you probably want to chime in on this slide too once Melissa covers the key points. But there are definitely like, you know, potholes, but you also, you know, don't want to create a what's the analogy? Pothole, sinkhole? Sinkhole is probably bigger than a pothole. So yeah, you don't want a sinkhole.
Yeah, of course, always knowing what to lean into is important, but also knowing what to lean away from or what not to do. So if you're not clear in your purpose and vision, going into inconsistent branding, right? What you're saying isn't the only important factor there. It's like what you're seeing, what you're creating, going back to aligning to brand, right? Copying the competition, which I think is also kind of in line with inconsistent touch points. Forgetting your target audience, being too trend driven, lack of emotional connection, changing too frequently and drastically. Really kind of wrapping this all into one, like what to stay away for. It's really being unique, knowing what you stand for, knowing what you're doing, knowing your non-negotiables and the things you absolutely have to do. But then also just getting creative, like what are the things we could do? What are the things we want to do? And then kind of running through that checklist on, are our competitors already doing this? Would this allow us to stand out? Is this something that's already being spoken on? So really crafting that foundation for yourself, but then expanding on some of those ideas and then kind of looking at the marketplace as to what exists and what people are really looking for and what they want.
Yeah. One thing I'll add to this too, that we hear all the time working with startups is that they don't have competition. They're like, oh no one out here is doing what we're doing exactly. And it's like, no, I understand that, but they don't know who you are. So like, what is the status quo is a good way to get a founder to think about. What does the market landscape look like? What is the status quo that your audience believes to be true that their options are? Because the alternatives might not be another brand. It might be another process or another action that they're taking, right? So like, really deeply understanding the status quo of what your audience is doing is going to help you, you know, protect yourself down the line by assuming there's no competition out there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good touch point too. And it's the whole, it's not what you say, but how you say it, right? You could be doing something completely different from your competitor, but if you're not really looking at how you're saying what you're doing, people are going to just automatically assume you're doing the same thing. So even if you're not intentionally copying, you may be by not really diving into that piece.
Yeah.
That's a great point. It reminds me of like the Maya Angelou quote that most of us know, I think, right? People won't remember what you say, do, etc. Like the feeling.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
Going back to that feeling, right? How you make people feel. Okay, so looking at fueling your content, understanding who you are, how to set yourself apart, how to apply that, but then really diving into putting the people at the center of that. If you're not putting your people first and you're putting yourself first, all of that work is really just going to fall short. So looking at the three P's or the three components of that, your promise, your problem, your solution. Your promise being your brand. Who are you? What do you stand for? What is the unique value you provide? And how do you attach that to that emotional connection? Your problem. What problem does your customer actually have? What challenges are they facing? What is it that they're doing that your product or your solution can make their life easier through applying? And then lastly, tying that in the solution or product, right? Where does your product step in? I think the line between the problem and solution is one of the things that is often convoluted a little bit and not differentiated well enough, which is what is the actual problem? A lot of times the solution is put in as the problem. And so when you're looking at actually telling a story and using that to fuel your content, really being sure to differentiate between the two and look at this as kind of a framework. What is the promise that you're providing? What is the problem the customer has? And then what is the solution? And kind of following that path will allow you to better differentiate those two pieces within your content and what you're saying.
Every campaign could follow this framework, like the messaging of the campaign. It's like, hey, make sure you have the brand promise, just front and center. Make sure you have, like, to your point, Maria, the right tone, the right visuals to go along with your campaign. But like, make sure this campaign is talking about, is addressing either directly or indirectly, like a problem that you help solve in a way, right? And then the solution, right? And sometimes that's through a more top of funnel, nature, meaning like you need to get people aware of the problem more versus the people are already aware of the problem, and it's more a little bit like, hey, just confirming it and then going to the solution. Like, it depends on your market maturity, the competition, a couple of other factors, but I think you could pretty much use this in like every campaign you run.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the piece here too is as I'm talking about this, I'm talking about a very dialed in narrow lens, right? If you want to bring this out broader and really apply it to campaigns, you can make that promise or the brand the always on like campaign that runs across the year, right? And then breaking that into the problem campaigns and then how you talk about that and some kind of quarterly plan and then tying it into the solution and then using that same roadmap not just for what you're saying and how you're saying it, but really is the foundation of how you're creating your campaigns through the year to then also guide the supporting content that you need to fuel those campaigns.
Very nice.
Going back to people and audience, right? So if you look at your customer journey, you understand your audience challenges and then execute the appropriate customer research, your content should really exist within the center of that. Not just existing within the center, but understanding different formats, different touch points, different campaigns, and even timeliness of that within the customer journey. Something that is gated and is a very dense piece of content, you may not want to put at the top of your customer journey or as the first touch point in your campaign. You may want to move that further down the funnel. Also understanding customer research, right? If you're just writing a bunch of blogs or writing about something that your audience doesn't really resonate with or engage with, maybe you're on Facebook or you're on Instagram, but your audience is on LinkedIn or not even active on social. Really tying in that customer research to not just the content, but the distribution as well, and tailoring that content to meet those customer challenges and drive engagement and put the content where your people are.
Well, yeah, it's like treating content like a product. I've talked a lot about this for a long time. Like, you need to think about the positioning of your pieces of content, especially your cornerstone content assets. These assets that are the strongest like lead magnets, if you're familiar with that term, like the things that are gonna have the biggest magnetic force to pull people into your brand or into your website. And how do you position those, not just on your website or the landing page of the content or whatever? It's like, how do you position that, to your point, Melissa, in the right channel at the right point of the customer journey? Is super important.
Yep.
Yeah. And make it easy for them to take action. I think that's like another thing that's really important to think about is like, okay, I feel good, I've done my research, but now it's like, how do we make it as easy as possible for them to do business with us, right? And like opening those doors very easily when the time is right for them versus like, being too aggressive on the front end. And it's just really important to, again, make it easy for them to do business with us when they're ready.
Yep, absolutely. So on this slide, really just trying to tie everything together, right? When we're looking at brand, we're looking at content, we're looking at campaigns. Talking about the brand and the promise being kind of that top of funnel type campaign, maybe always on campaign, and then the content that ties to that. So you're looking at more blogs, guides, on-demand content that kind of ties in the customer and their problem to your brand. So what are they looking for? What are their needs? And then who are you within that kind of helps fill that need? Moving into more of the middle funnel type of campaign that ties more to the problem, right? People researching, having questions, having challenges, having something that they have a need for, but they don't quite know how to solve or satisfy that need yet. So looking at more of the ebooks, the white papers, the webinars, the testimonials, and more of those middle of funnel campaigns that maybe are quarterly and more specifically tied to business goals, business objectives, etc. And then moving into the bottom, looking at your actual solution, the product you provide, that's where your case studies, your live demos, and even more of your monthly or quarterly campaigns come in. They're less about the customer or the brand promise and more about your specific product. So that's where having smaller pieces of content or more specific pieces of content and less of those always on campaigns comes in. The one thing noted here that's not touched on is kind of that ungated content versus gated content. I think a big component of that is not just what the content is, but again, tying that into what is the purpose of the campaign. You could have a white paper that technically is middle of funnel or even a case study that's bottom of funnel, but if the purpose is to drive brand awareness or have people engage with that, having it gated is just going to kind of remove that. So really understanding the objective of your content and how it's tied into your campaigns and what you're trying to accomplish when considering the kind of gated versus ungated.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the 80-20 rule. 80% of your leads should come from 20% of the content, and that 20% of the content is gated. So 20% of your content is gated, 80% isn't. I know that's a little mental gymnastics there, maybe, because I just use 80-20, two different variations, but it's the Pareto principle, right? It's like 20% of the content's gated drives 80% of your leads. Like, it's just my opinion. I mean,
But I think that's partly too where testing, right? Testing different formats of gating, different ways of gating. And even when you're looking at your channels, right? Having a paid campaign where you're testing gated versus ungated assets and looking at what conversion rate are you getting? Is there any kind of differentiation there? And then as we're talking about activating across channels, not just web and social content, newsletters and other emails. So do you have any kind of outbound ongoing email cadence? Do you have nurture campaigns tied to some of your other initiatives where you can tie in some of these content pieces? Maybe someone came in and read a blog, signed up for your email newsletter. Knowing what blog or being able to have the capability to know what piece of content brought them in and then put them into an email nurture that has associated content that really tells the story of your brand through that. Again, looking at your blogs and website, your website should really be the library for your user to not only get to know your brand better and your solution better, but also answer their questions. So again, putting the people at the center of that. What is the user journey? What are the different pieces of content? How are we helping them inform themselves and put ourselves at the center of that as the authoritative figure and the solution for their questions? And then lastly, the customer-centric multi-channel campaigns. Really just looking at this at how do we tie it all together? How do we talk about the top level framework and then bring it down to the bottom as far as like specific campaigns, specific touch points, and then again, kind of reframing that bottom up. What do we need within the specific components to really support that overarching narrative and that brand story?
I mean, every campaign you create, Melissa, like needs content, right? In some aspect.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, it is a core part of the fuel for the campaign. And then if you take the brand archetype things we were talking about and tie that into your content better, and then tie that into the messaging and positioning of the overall campaign, that is really going to up level the performance of the campaign because it's going to be truly more integrated. It's going to resonate better because of all the things you said, right? You're focused on the problems, the audience, or a more specific audience with more specific problems. You're getting at the channel level, which we saw in the first webinar. You know, you have channel as one of the core parts of the integrated revenue campaign framework. And then the last thing I'll say is that, yeah, you think of customers, to your point, as a channel. Like your customers, moving into the last couple slides now, are a channel for your campaigns, just like your employees, your sales team is a channel. Like a lot of people don't think about that. Like, wait a minute, we have to use paid ads, we have to use some of the other traditional type of channels. But no, like your people, to your point around people first, are a channel. So when you think about customer-led growth, I just got I think 3 or 4 slides on this, everyone. It's really a newer methodology that's about how do you work with your customers to first get them to value. Like step 1 is you got to onboard them and you got to see value. Step 2 is, all right, the people that are seeing value, getting the expected results, you fulfilled the promise, both with your product and your brand. How do you partner with them in a way, and I have some examples of how to do this on the next few slides, to extend that value for them, but also for you, the brand, the business. And then it's like, how do you go above and beyond? How do you make sure that it's not, the retention is not just hinging on the product, but it's the brand strengthens the retention of the customer. I see, Maria, you're shaking your head a lot on that one.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Your best evangelist should be your customers, right? Like a referral or a recommendation from a friend and someone you know and trust is gonna do so much better than like cold outreach, cold outbound, right? Like you want people championing your brand and the experience that they had.
Exactly. So if that's the methodology, right? Those are the 3 steps: onboard, partner, delight, to actually activate customer-led growth to help you drive revenue through your install base of customers, but also through new sales. To your point on referrals, Maria, there are a ton of tactical things that can go into this. If you take a look at this list, everyone, I'm sure you can name or point out a couple of things you're doing today or have done in the past to help with this. The key is how do you kind of organize these a bit better, either as part of your campaign or make them a campaign on their own.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, like references, I don't know if I would have a campaign that's just references, right? But like if you have a campaign that's geared more towards the bottom of the funnel, to Melissa's point, references is something that can be used to help that campaign deliver against its goals. The goal of the campaign is probably not just pipeline, but turning pipeline into revenue. So if we're really doing a hyper-targeted campaign for open pipeline, I would argue references should be part of that. So that's a tactic of customer-led growth, right? So how do you prioritize these? That's probably a common question. The first thing you should do is what Maria was just saying, which is identify your advocates and champions. I'd argue advocates are different than champions. Champions have a higher degree of affinity and strong feeling and emotional response to your brand and product. But identify your advocates and champions, and then basically see, out of all these things, which might be best to help you with your current campaigns. Like you just might be short on customer stories. Go ahead, Melissa.
Yeah, I was going to say on customer communications and community management, I think that also ties into something we talked about early on, which is reputation, right? And that's also a really good area to look to. Like, what are online platforms? What are the customers saying about you? If you have a customer service or a customer support team, like what are those some of those communications looking like? And how can you take that and pull that out and integrate that into your campaigns, but also use that as fuel to better understand your own reputation within your community?
Great point. It's a great point. Which is a nice segue into this next slide about marketing to your customers or advocates or champions versus marketing with. So you need to do both, right? At some scale, as your company grows, gets bigger, as you have more customers, especially once you reach a threshold of, there's really no magic number, but it's 50, say 50 customers, right? Like you're going to be marketing to them more. Once you have like 20, 15 to 20 customers, you're going to want to start marketing with those customers a good amount, right? Because like those are your first, basically your first indication of product market fit if you're at that end of the company journey of building a company. But once you get to that, say like 50 number, you have to figure out how to, traditionally use, say, customer marketing type things, which is some of the stuff you saw on the last slide. But some of it is also building a campaign, targeted at your customers. Again, a lot of people think, oh, I have all these campaigns. I got to use campaigns to create revenue for net new customers. The big unlock, like if you don't have a campaign going on right now this quarter, or in Q1, or if you haven't done one in a long time, say a quarter or two, build a campaign just for customers. And this goes back to webinar number 1, where we talked about how much revenue are you expecting to get from your existing customers, both on the retention side, like so you're growing revenue through just renewals, but also on the upsell, cross-sell motion. If 50% of your revenue is expecting to come from some sort of customer number, you would want to have probably half your campaigns, at least close to them, that number, like going after your customers. And that's going to your advocates, going to your customers, versus all of your campaigns. This might be, maybe not everyone aligns with this, but my opinion is every campaign you have should have your customers involved in some way. Every campaign. It can be tricky, but like, for example, your brand campaigns, that's where you just have customers potentially be part of your podcast. Maybe you have a guest and you have your customer as a guest on your podcast, right? Maybe you have them in quotes, on your website, or quotes in your content, right? It doesn't have to be heavy-handed, but infusing their voice in the campaign is how you continue to fuel them. Any other thoughts though, Melissa, Marie, on this?
No, I agree. And I think also leading with the customer story piece, right? Making that actually the front and center focal point versus the bottom of the funnel. Let me support this narrative, support this conversation with a case study or a customer story.
Yeah, I totally agree. Get your customers involved, find out what makes them tick and how they want to help you, because if it comes naturally and they're a big champion of your brand, they're going to want to help you. And as a business, it's also way easier to upsell existing customers than to get net new customers. So find out ways to, allocate resources to explore what makes sense with your existing customer base, because it depends on who your customer is and what your relationship is with them too. We can't tell you, all the silver bullets, but your customer better than anyone. So really dig in to figure that out.
Yeah, we talked about that during the first webinar. Like, you just go to your CFO, like, hey, we can acquire customers, using this much money and resources, versus we could focus more on customer, success and upsell. Like, it's going to cost us this much less, maybe. Like, we still need resources, but we're going to save some money. So the financial side of your campaigns and how you continue to fuel them is it's always a debate. And I always, as a quick aside, like when you think about metrics, which is the last slide here, folks, like using metrics that, in this case, say the head of finance, CFO, really cares about, is a great way to build credibility and trust in asking for, a resource down the road. Like being aligned to what they care about, which is, hey, I put together this financial plan. I got the board to sign off on it. The C-levels, involved, they've committed. Maybe they disagreed a bit, but they've committed to it. They're united, they're aligned. Like, how can we create campaigns to solve, or go after those numbers together, versus thinking it too in the weeds and like, hey, we want to do this because we think it's cool in the customer, but like, how does that help the business? Like that's the bigger point. So this is Sendoso. Sendoso does a tremendous job of customer-led growth, I think. Leslie, when she was at Sendoso, she actually has a great masterclass inside TAC Insider about this. They had this idea of super sender.